Good morrow to thee, neighbor. This, of course, is my recap video for 18th century Eastern Europe, where I talk about things I left out of the videos, correct mistakes that I made in the videos, and answer questions from Gaon and Navi level patrons on Patreon. Before going right in, a lot of what I talked about in these 3 episodes dealt a lot with courts and the Jewish legal system in general. And as it happens, we have a kind of news story about this. Yitzhak Melamed, one of the foremost scholars on Spinoza, asked the rabbi of Amsterdam's Grand Old Synagogue, Joseph Sarfati, for permission to film in the synagogue's library for a documentary about Spinoza, and Sarfati not only said no, but declared Melamed forbidden from entering the synagogue. However, this was not Sarfati's decision to make. Spoiler alert for some of the issues I touched on, but Jews are emancipated in the Netherlands today. They have been for a long time, and while the rabbinate does still exist in Amsterdam and is fully entitled to make decisions regarding its private property, Sarfati is not the chief rabbi, and the synagogue is actually the property of the Jewish Cultural Quarter, which is a kind of trust owned by the city of Amsterdam and runs the parts of the synagogue like the library that are not the exclusive domain of religious services. They overturned Sarfati's ban, as you might expect, though Sarfati is reportedly still quite salty about it. And that, my friends, is modern Jewish jurisprudence in action. So almost everything people wanted to know about this episode, or that they took issue with, revolves around my characterization of the Baal Shem Tov and of early Hasidism. Things like his lack of fluency in Hebrew, his lack of formal education, and overall, there was a lot of frustration that I omitted or disregarded parts of his official biography, Shivhei HaBesht. So I said in the video that much of what is traditionally said about the life of the Baal Shem Tov comes from Shivhei HaBesht, which was published in 1815. So not only after he had died, but even after all of his students had also died, and in a time when Hasidic Judaism had crystallized into something much more cohesive and organized than it had been in his time. So as you might expect, it contains many legends, and even at the time, it was totally uncontroversial among non-Hasidim to say that most of it did not actually reflect the life of the Besht. What little we have of his contemporary writings are pretty useful as a point of comparison, and they are in Hebrew, but they were dictated by him. Not written, he had someone else write them for him, and they were almost certainly translated. And I made a conscious effort to limit my depiction to what has been verified by contemporary court records and that sort of thing. That isn't to say he wasn't an intelligent person. To my eyes, he clearly was. But he was not this miraculously educated person that the authors of Shivhei HaBesht claimed, nor was his version of Hasidism the same as the one they had inherited and perpetuated. It was a long evolution. Now, some of you noticed that the Besht as I depicted him resembles an American actor from the 1960s and 1970s named Martin Balsam, and asked if that's where the name Balsam comes from. And in a Jewish context, the answer is yes. It has other origins, but Balsam was the Polish rendering of Baal Shem. And Martin Balsam himself was, if not a descendant of the Baal Shem Tov, certainly the descendant of a notable Baal Shem of that era. The reason I used Martin Balsam, aside from the pure enjoyment of the people who would notice, is because the Baal Shem Tov had no portrait. He was not a rich man, he lived in the country, and it wasn't something that was considered important at the time. Shneor Zalman was really the first Hasidic leader to see the power of mass media, such as it was, in propagating Hasidism, so we do have depictions of him and many Rebbes afterward, but not the Baal Shem Tov. As a result of which, the image that is commonly used to depict the Besht is in fact a portrait of the Baal Shem of London, which is why I really wanted to highlight him as a distinct figure in the video. My portrait of him is based on a portrait from the 1780s, so later in his life, and it's an English painting by an American painter. It has nothing to do with the Baal Shem Tov. I suspect that because of, as I said, the mass media value in having a picture of the Baal Shem Tov, various people down the line misidentified this portrait, maybe even through Google Images, and mistook it for the wrong guy. They even make this mistake at the Anu Museum here in Tel Aviv. Navi-level patron Jeremy Biskind asks, what distinguishes Hasidism today from other forms of orthodoxy? I get a lot of questions like this, both on Patreon and in the comments, and I thought I'd explained it pretty well, but I suppose that the difference is actually pretty informal. Hasidim, obviously, have a much greater emphasis on the primacy of the Rebbe, even though there are now non-dynastic Hasidic movements. And of course, there are things like Pilpul and Payot and Shakling, but these are all differences of convention and practice. Hasidim and Mitnagdim did not disagree on any of the fundamentals of Jewish law, just the implementation. In a lot of these cases, they saw themselves as being more practical, like having prayer times at a later hour than sunrise, so you would be better equipped mentally to praise God, rather than having to get up at dawn and not having the right presence of mind. It's stuff like that. The conflict between Hasidim and Mitnagdim was over the nature of the institution rather than any theological argument. And it really still is, though they're much more aligned politically now than they were back then. Gaon-level patron Brian Tooten asks, with the Hasidic movement moving down through the Pale of Settlement and approaching the northern border of the Ottoman Empire, how, if at all, did the explosion of Hasidic thought throughout this period affect the Sephardi Mizrahi Jews living in the Ottoman Empire? Now, I can't know what I don't know to look for, but based on my research, as well as the situation today, the answer seems to be very little. A lot of people have asked what was going on among Sephardic Jewry during this time. I've covered a fair bit of that already in some of my specials on India and Iran and Central Asia, and we'll be talking more about Sephardic Jews in other parts of the world in future episodes. But as I said in the video, the circumstances that gave rise to Hasidism were very specific to issues within the Jewish legal system in Poland, so it shouldn't be too surprising that it didn't happen elsewhere. Obviously, newer Hasidic movements and dynasties have come to exist outside the former lands of the Commonwealth, but almost all of the newer ones are minor offshoots of earlier dynasties that moved out through immigration. To my knowledge, there are only 2 Hasidic dynasties that were founded sui generis outside the Commonwealth in that early period, and those are the dynasties of Satmar and Nikolsburg, which were in Transylvania and Bohemia respectively. Like with Mizrahim, it didn't really catch on outside the Commonwealth. Quick correction, Eybeschütz's book was And I Will Come to the Spring Today. In Hebrew, I and spring are the same word, ayin, spelled the same. That's spring in the sense of a source of water. And even the English sources that I used referred to the book exclusively in Hebrew. I like to translate things because the vast majority of my viewers don't speak Hebrew, but Hebrew also isn't my first language, so my brain went into autopilot. For those of you in the comments who have been suggesting that I run for parliament, this is a good reason why I shouldn't. Gaon-level patron Learnabit asks, how long did the Dunme and Frankists last? How did Frankism, and more broadly Sabbateanism, finally die off? It shouldn't surprise anyone to hear that Frankism, a movement which upholds someone other than Jesus as the Messiah, did not fit in well with the Catholic Church. After that conversion, it ended up being the church who was trying to hunt the movement down, and it lingered on a bit with his daughter Eva, but as far as we can tell, it died with her in 1816. Now, this may surprise those of you in the comments who pointed out that Louis Brandeis, the first Jewish member of the US Supreme Court, is often said to have been the son of Frankist parents. So I looked a little deeper into this, and it turns out that that's wrong, but it's not arbitrarily wrong. It's certainly something you would expect people to say at the time. Brandeis's parents were Prague Sabbateans, and this was Sabbateanism much more in the vein of Eybeschütz than anything to do with Frank. Prague was the last place in the world where Sabbateanism hung on pretty much at all. And by this point, it had basically lost all of its distinguishing characteristics and just become this kind of vague vestigial identity among a handful of families. And Brandeis's parents would have been the very last generation of people to have even that. The reason they're said to have been Frankists is because once Frankism was fully dead and gone, that was just the pejorative by which any remaining Sabbateans were labeled. And that's pretty much the same thing that happened with the Dunme in Turkey. It pretty quickly lost any of its religious trappings and became a kind of generic middle-class secular identity. People of Dunme descent were pretty active in the attempted political reforms at the end of the Ottoman Empire. and like calling someone in Prague a Frankist, it's often just an accusation thrown at any political reformist the person using the term didn't like. In fact, nowadays, it's mostly used as a slur against trans women. And occasionally you will find people who claim to be Sabbatean today, but as far as I can tell, this is just a modern affectation. A minor correction. It was the Sultan Selim that conquered the Mamluks, after which his son Suleiman sent Jews to resettle in the Holy Land. I had gotten that right in my video about the Safed Circle, so this was just a dumb little oversight. Navi-level patron Jay Fleischman asks, in the episodes on Judaism in medieval Spain, there were a number of examples of Jews who reached great heights of power and influence within the non-Jewish government. To what extent did this happen in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? You noted that Berek Yoselowicz of the Beardlings was the first ever Jewish commander of a Commonwealth military unit. Does this imply that Jews exerted minimal authority over the Sejm or the PLC monarchy? In short, yes. In a technical sense, Jews didn't have any authority over the Sejm. Only members of the nobility could vote, and although Poland's nobility was a much larger share of the population than in most European countries, in a still very feudal society like Poland, that still didn't include Jews. When I say that Jews had maximum autonomy in Poland, what that really means is that Jewish courts had maximum legal power over Jewish subjects. So while Poland certainly had a lot of Jews, and they were very economically important and in certain cases quite wealthy, they were off in their own legal sector and fulfilled a very specific role in the functionality of the Polish state. And these courts were also an oligarchy. They were elected, the council wasn't really elected, and it's hard to overstate just how alienated Jewish society had become from the mainstream of Poland after the deluge through the kinds of abuses of power that were able to flourish in that autonomous system. And that's something that I'll talk about more in the next episode because that fueled a lot of criticism of the entire concept of autonomy and the pretty rapid shift in the coming years towards emancipation. Gaon-level patron Carmel Saida asks, what was the connection between the Vilna Gaon and Zalman to Vilnius's nickname of Yerushalayim Delita, or Jerusalem of Lithuania? Well, the Gaon arrived in Vilnius at a time when the Jewish community there was fairly new. Even within his own lifetime, Vilnius would have had a very small, insignificant Jewish population starting out. The change came when Jews began to arrive there fleeing pogroms in Kaunas. Of course, Vilnius was the Lithuanian capital, so it was already a place of importance, and the relatively simultaneous arrival of the Gaon and a permanent Jewish population basically automatically made it one of the major centers of Jewish thought worldwide. It's as simple as that. Navi-level patron Osher Gordon asks, if Lithuania's Jews were satisfied with the state of the rabbinate there, such that there was not a market for the teachings of Yekutiel Gordon and other Baalei Shem, how was Shneur Zalman successful in establishing a large following there? So Hasidism really never caught on in Lithuania the way it did further south. Even today, the colloquial term for a mitnaged is litvak. So Chabad's success mostly comes down to the fact that it was the only game in town. It was also the only Hasidic movement by the third generation that was doing a lot of outreach, at a time when all the other dynasties had pretty much completely turned inward. For example, Shneur Zalman set up branches of Chabad all over Lithuania, rather than just having one center where people had to go to him. Which, by the way, is why most Hasidic followings today tend to all live in one place. And of course, like I said in the video, Chabad philosophy was just a lot more aligned with Lithuanian sensibilities than other movements. Gaon-level patron Moshe Rosenstein asks, given all of the generations of positive experiences in Poland, why do you think it is that Poland seems to be disproportionately vilified by many Jews today for its antisemitism? It seems to me that even the difficult times pale in comparison to other European countries. Why do you think it is that Poland gets such a bad reputation regarding the Jews? Well, times change. I didn't get into this as much as I could have, but anti-Semitism was very much on the rise in Poland in the century after the deluge, as the Polish state became more and more dysfunctional, and this became even more so after it ceased to exist. As Spinoza said, a constitution without a state is just paper. And as the Commonwealth faded from memory, Polish identity became much more attached to tangible things like the Polish language and especially the Catholic Church. And other than the dictatorship of Marshal Piłsudski, this didn't change much in the 20th century. I'm sure if I get to that period, I will cover those things. And even today, Poland is now under a very hardcore nationalist government that doesn't want to acknowledge even the possibility that any Polish citizens were complicit or sympathetic to the liquidation of their country's Jewish community as being unpatriotic. It's a very common thing you see for certain rulers to act as if loving your country must be unconditional. And that usually overlaps with the trope of perpetuating bigotry by denying its existence. As a result of which, relations between Israel and Poland are the worst they've been since the Cold War. Now, because of that recent history, there are certain extreme attitudes against Poland within Israel, particularly regarding the issue of Nazi collaborators and anti-Semitism in general, that I, as someone raised in America, am totally unfamiliar with. And this has only just been alerted to me. And, like in Poland, this seems to be most prevalent among hardcore nationalists. But I can't really speak to that. And equally, to reject the issue entirely on the basis of the legacy of the Commonwealth would be wrong. I suspect that popular ignorance of the broader scope of Jewish history in Poland may have something to do with the way that Jewish history has traditionally been taught, both in Israel and in diaspora, that has done a great deal to fuel the popularity of this channel. But again, times change. So that's 18th century Eastern Europe. So many great questions, so thank you all for that. And now we'll be heading westward for the Emancipation Trilogy. Special thanks to my patrons, including Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, Jay Fleischman, Osher Gordon, Bob Huddy, Eric Leiderman, Raphael, and Sergei Gerasimov.